at that monkey serving our table. Madame Lian Zhao sneered in flawless Mandarin, her jeweled hand gesturing toward the waiter as if she were pointing at a circus animal. The American businessmen around her laughed nervously, unaware of the meaning, but eager to echo her amusement. Terrified of offending the billionaire who controlled billions in contracts. But Samuel Carter understood every single word, every poisoned syllable dripping from her tongue. He felt it strike like a knife, yet his face remained perfectly calm, trained by years of swallowing humiliation far greater than this. His tray did not shake, his shoulders did not flinch. Only his eyes betrayed him, eyes that carried a storm waiting to break. Madame Lian leaned back, her arrogance filling the Golden Lotus with an invisible stench, believing she had reduced him to silence. What she did not know was that Samuel spoke Mandarin with a fluency that could shame her own assistants. What she did not know was that he had once dined with ambassadors, lectured at universities, and written essays on diplomacy that the world still quoted. To her, he was just a nameless servant in a black uniform. To himself, he was still a man of dignity, carrying a secret too powerful to reveal at the wrong time. Around them, the glittering chandeliers reflected wealth and power, but Samuel stood in the shadows, preparing for the moment when truth would pierce the mask of cruelty. Every insult she threw was fuel, every laugh at his expense was fire, and soon the blaze would consume the one who believed herself untouchable. Would you, if seated at that table, have stayed silent? Or would you have spoken against such arrogance? Leave your answer below. Long before Samuel Carter stood in a waiter's uniform at the Golden Lotus, he had worn tailored suits and carried the respect of ambassadors. Just a year earlier, he was not the help. He was Dr. Samuel Carter, a name spoken with admiration in diplomatic circles from Washington to Beijing. He had earned his doctorate at Harvard, specializing in Asian studies, focusing particularly on Chinese business culture and diplomatic protocol. His Mandarin was flawless, so fluent that even native speakers sometimes paused in surprise. He had spent 5 years in Beijing as a cultural attaché, bridging the fragile relationship between two great powers. He had sat across from ministers and trade delegates, his words shaping agreements worth billions. He had been a man of dignity, a man whose knowledge carried weight in rooms where history was being written. And then it all crumbled. The fall came not from enemies abroad, but from envy at home. Edward Miller, a colleague at the State Department, had always envied Samuel's brilliance. Where Samuel's charisma opened doors, Miller's mediocrity closed them. And so he planted false documents, whispering to investigators that Samuel had been leaking sensitive information to China. It was a lie, a calculated betrayal. The FBI stormed into Samuel's life, dragging his name through headlines, branding him a traitor before the world. For 7 months, he lived under suspicion, enduring interrogations, cameras at his door, colleagues who once toasted him, now crossing the street to avoid his gaze. His reputation was gutted, his career torn apart, not by guilt but by rumor. When the investigation ended, the truth came out. The evidence was fake, a forgery so clumsy it should never have been believed. But in Washington, innocence does not erase suspicion. The stain remained. No university would hire him. No agency would trust him. Edward Miller, the architect of the lie, received the promotion that should have been Samuel's. And Samuel, once a rising star, found every door slammed shut. Pride kept him from begging, but pride did not feed him. His savings vanished. Friends disappeared. What remained was survival. The Golden Lotus, Manhattan's most exclusive Chinese restaurant, offered him a job as a waiter. The irony was cruel. The same man who once hosted delegations there now served wine and cleared plates, invisible to those who once applauded him. For 8 months, Samuel endured humiliation with the patience of a man gathering strength. Night after night, wealthy diners mocked him, assuming his dark skin meant ignorance, that his quiet demeanor meant submission. But Samuel was not broken. Beneath the uniform, the scholar remained. Beneath the silence, the strategist waited. Each insult was added to the ledger of his memory. Each laugh, another stone placed on the scale of justice. His dignity was not gone. It was waiting. And so as Madame Lian Zhao poured venom in Mandarin across her table, Samuel felt no shame. Only a dangerous calm settled over him. He had endured worse storms, and storms, after all, clear the sky. Soon, very soon, she would learn who he really was. The dinner stretched on like a cruel theater play, and Madame Lian Zhao was both director and a star of her own performance. From the moment the appetizers arrived, she made Samuel Carter the target of her entertainment. Switching effortlessly between Mandarin and broken English, she used every opportunity to belittle him. He probably doesn't even know how to read, she sneered in Mandarin, pretending to fix her napkin as Samuel set a dish on the table. The businessmen shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They didn't understand her words, but they felt the venom behind them, the way her laughter rang too sharp, too cruel. They forced smiles, afraid to lose her favor, afraid that confronting her arrogance would cost them millions. Samuel, however, understood every word. Each syllable cut deep, but not into his pride, into his patience. His face remained impassive, his movements steady. Inside, though, the fire grew. His hands trembled slightly, but it was not fear that made them shake. It was rage restrained, a storm contained in a fragile vessel. He thought back to nights in Beijing when he sat with Chinese diplomats discussing trade, culture, and the fragile bonds between nations. He had once been respected for the very knowledge Madame Leon now mocked. To her, he was an ignorant servant. To himself, he was still a man who had spoken across negotiating tables where history was made. Every insult she hurled became a stone laid on the foundation of something larger, something inevitable. Madame Lien's cruelty grew bolder with every glass of wine. She laughed at his posture, ridiculed his skin, even imagined his family as nothing but poverty and disgrace. That one probably has 10 people crammed into a single apartment, she spat in Mandarin, pointing her jeweled finger at him as though he were a specimen to be dissected. The businessmen glanced at one another, their unease mounting, but none dared stop her. They were too bound by fear of losing her contracts. Samuel cataloged it all, every word, every gesture, every insult. He stored them like a librarian collecting evidence. He knew that arrogance always leaves a trail, and she was leaving hers in broad daylight. What she did not see was that her performance was not weakening him. It was sharpening him. Each humiliation was like a whetstone against steel, honing his resolve to an edge that could cut through her empire. The Golden Lotus glittered with wealth, chandeliers dripping crystal, gold-trimmed curtains swaying softly with the air conditioning. But to Samuel, it felt more like a courtroom. Madame Lian was not dining. She was testifying, damning herself with every careless word. His role, though she did not know it yet, was to be both witness and judge. The longer she spoke, the heavier her sentence became. By the time dessert was ordered, the atmosphere at the table was suffocating. Even Richard Collins, a hardened CEO, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He sensed the line between arrogance and cruelty had already been crossed, though he lacked the courage to admit it. Madame Lian mistook their silence for admiration. She believed she was teaching them a lesson about hierarchy. What she did not know was that the lesson belonged to her. Samuel, quiet and steady, carried on with the serenity of a man who held a secret more powerful than her fortune. And in that silence, a storm gathered, one that would not break tonight, but soon, very soon, with the force of justice long delayed. The Golden Lotus pulsed with quiet luxury, but in the narrow staff corridor behind its velvet curtains, the atmosphere shifted. Samuel Carter stepped away from the glittering dining hall, his polished shoes carrying him not to another table, but to the employee restroom. He pushed open the door, the hum of laughter from the main room muffled by thick walls. For a moment he stood before the mirror, staring at his own reflection. The black vest, the crisp white shirt, the bow tie that marked him as a servant. It all felt like a disguise. Beneath it lived a man the world had once respected, a man trained in diplomacy, not in pouring wine for the arrogant. He exhaled, then reached into his pocket for his phone. His hands no longer shook with rage, but with determination. He opened his contacts and found the name he had not dialed in nearly a year. Professor Alan Wong, mentor, scholar, father figure, the man who had once called him the brightest mind in cross-cultural studies. His thumbs hesitated over the screen before the words came pouring out. Alan, I need your help. I'm at the Golden Lotus in Manhattan. Madame Lian Zhao is here making extreme racist remarks in Mandarin, assuming no one understands. I have recordings. Can we meet tomorrow? His chest tightened as he pressed send. Seconds passed like hours. Then a vibration. The reply came swift and urgent. Samuel, my God, where have you been all this time? Yes, meet me tomorrow. Leon is already under investigation for corruption and unethical behavior. Your evidence could be decisive. Samuel's lips curved into something he had not felt in months. A smile. Not of amusement, but of quiet vindication. For so long, he had carried humiliation like a stone strapped to his back. Tonight, that burden began to shift. He was no longer just a waiter swallowing cruelty. He was a witness, a chronicler of arrogance, and now perhaps an instrument of justice. His thoughts raced as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Professor Wong was not just any academic. He had the ear of diplomats, policymakers, and business leaders on both sides of the Pacific. If Lian Zhao's words reached those circles, the consequences would ripple far beyond this dinner. He washed his hands, not because they needed cleaning, but because he felt the symbolic weight of it, washing away the filth of her insults, preparing himself for the moment when truth would come to light. In the mirror, his reflection looked different now. Less like a servant, more like a soldier preparing for a battle of a different kind. Not fought with weapons, but with words, recordings, and truths that cut deeper than any blade. He returned to the dining hall with the same calm mask, carrying himself with the serenity of one who held a secret weapon invisible to all others. Madame Lian did not notice the shift in his demeanor. She was too busy basking in her own cruelty, mistaking silence for submission, interpreting nervous laughter as admiration. To her, Samuel was still a monkey, still a man beneath her notice. She had no idea she was building the case against herself, one insult at a time. The businessmen shifted uncomfortably again as she spoke, but no one dared challenge her. Samuel glanced at them briefly, seeing not allies but spectators. Yet he pitied them as much as he pitied her. They thought they were watching a simple performance, unaware they were present at a trial, that their silence was testimony, their nervous laughter evidence. Samuel's calm grew deeper. He had lived through fire already, 7 months of FBI suspicion, the collapse of his career, the abandonment of friends. Compared to that, this dinner was nothing but the last act of a play whose ending had already been written. In his pocket, his phone held the key. With every second Madame Lian spoke, she dug her own grave a little deeper, her words preserved forever in digital ink. Samuel knew the storm was coming, and when it broke, it would not just change this night. It would change his life. It would change hers. It might even change the fragile balance between two nations. And so, as he placed another dish on the table, his eyes betrayed none of the storm within. He bowed slightly, the gesture of a waiter. But in his heart, he stood tall as a diplomat once more, ready to reclaim his dignity, not with rage, but with justice. When Samuel Carter returned to the dining hall, Madame Lian Zhao had grown bold with drink and arrogance. Her jeweled hands gestured wildly as she told the American businessman that true progress was never about equality, that some races were born to lead and others were born to serve. They shifted in their seats, discomfort etched across their faces, but still they remained silent. To oppose her was to risk contracts worth millions, and silence to them seemed safer. Then came the moment that would fracture the entire evening. Madame Lian leaned back, her lips curling into a cruel smile, and she pointed directly at Samuel. "You," she said in broken English, her tone mocking. "You dance like monkey? Show us funny dance." The businessmen froze, their forks suspended in midair, eyes darting between her and the waiter she mocked. Samuel placed the tray he carried carefully on the sideboard. He straightened his back, the muscles in his shoulders tightening like a bowstring pulled taut. Then for the first time that evening, he smiled. Not a smile of amusement, nor one of subservience. It was a smile of quiet power, a smile that belonged to a man who had endured enough. And then, in flawless Mandarin, his voice rang through the golden chamber. "Madame Zhao, I believe you are confusing this establishment with a zoo." The silence that followed was absolute. Chopsticks clattered against porcelain bowls. Glasses trembled in hands. The American businessman, who had spent years working with translators, recognized instantly the precision of his words, the elegance of his tone. This was not the Mandarin of a beginner. This was the Mandarin of a scholar. Madame Leon's face drained of color. For the first time all night, she seemed unsure of herself. What? What did you say? She stammered in English, her arrogance crumbling. Samuel's eyes never wavered as he continued, this time in classical Mandarin, his pronunciation refined, each syllable deliberate. It is fascinating, he said, how some people confuse wealth with wisdom, birth with virtue, and cruelty with strength. A collective gasp rippled across the table. The businessmen stared at him as though seeing him for the first time. Richard Collins, the most senior among them, leaned forward, his face pale. He had worked with Chinese interpreters for years, and he recognized not just fluency, but mastery. This waiter did not merely speak Mandarin, he commanded it. Madame Leon shook her head in disbelief. You can't. You're just a waiter. Samuel's voice was calm but unyielding. Yes, I am a waiter, but I am also Dr. Samuel Carter, Harvard PhD in Asian Studies, former cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, author of 17 academic articles on Chinese diplomacy, coordinator of trade delegations between our nations. I have spoken across the table from ministers while you attended parties in Shanghai. His words struck harder than any weapon, each fact a blade cutting through the illusion she had built around herself. Richard Collins nearly dropped his wineglass. My God, he whispered, you're Samuel Carter. I read your thesis on Chinese investment in American infrastructure. You vanished from the diplomatic world a year ago. Samuel gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a truth long buried. I was falsely accused of espionage by the FBI. Though I was cleared, the stain remained. Doors closed. And so I took this job to survive. His gaze fixed on Madame Leon, piercing, steady. For 8 months, I have endured insults from people who thought I could not understand. But I understood every word, Madame Zhao, every slur, every laugh, every performance of cruelty. The room seemed to shrink around her. Madame Leon's breath quickened, her arrogance dissolving into panic. The businessmen stared in stunned silence, realizing they had spent the evening complicit in humiliating not a servant, but one of the foremost experts on the very culture she claimed to represent. Samuel's calm voice carried the weight of truth, heavier than her fortune, sharper than her insults. In that moment, the power in the room shifted. The billionaire who believed herself untouchable was exposed, and the man she had tried to break had revealed himself as her equal. And more. The Golden Lotus had never known silence so heavy. It pressed against the walls, against the chandeliers, against every breath the businessmen tried to take. Madame Leon Zhao sat frozen, her jeweled fingers twitching against the stem of her champagne glass. She had mocked Samuel Carter for nearly 2 hours, never suspecting that the man she called monkey understood every syllable. Now the mask had been ripped away. You wouldn't dare, she whispered, her voice cracking, her eyes darting between Samuel and the men at the table, who suddenly looked at her with something close to disgust. Samuel reached calmly into his pocket and withdrew his phone. He held it up, the glow of the screen illuminating his steady hands. Of course I dared, he said softly. Every insult, every slur, every cruel performance, recorded, including the video you made of yourself boasting in Mandarin about racial hierarchies. The businessman gasped. Richard Collins leaned forward, his voice sharp. She recorded herself? Samuel's eyes never left Madame Leon. She did. For 90 minutes, she has been writing her own confession. The weight of his words hung in the air like a verdict already delivered. Madame Leon tried to gather herself, her chin lifting in a show of defiance. You can't expose me, she hissed. It would destroy my reputation, my contracts, my company. Samuel's smile was sad, almost pitying. Perhaps, but tell me, Madame Zhao, does dignity depend on wealth? Does respect require a bank account? Or is it the right of every human being, regardless of what uniform they wear? The question echoed through the room. The businessmen shifted uncomfortably, their silence this time not out of fear, but out of shame. For the first time they realized they had been silent witnesses to something monstrous, complicit in cruelty by doing nothing. Richard Collins placed his hands flat on the table, his jaw clenched. He looked at Samuel not as a waiter, but as a man who had just restored the balance of the evening. Madame Leon's arrogance faltered further. Her eyes, once sharp and cruel, now flickered with panic. Perhaps, perhaps we can reach an agreement, she said, her tone almost pleading. I can compensate you. I can ensure you never need to work as a waiter again. Samuel shook his head. This is not about money. It has never been about money. For 8 months, people like you believed I was invisible, that I was beneath notice. You believed dignity could be stripped away with a word. But dignity is not yours to give, nor is it yours to take. His voice, steady and calm, carried the weight of years of humiliation transmuted into quiet strength. The businessmen could not look at her. Their gazes dropped, their appetite gone, their loyalty shattered. Madame Lianzhao, who had entered the Golden Lotus as a queen, now sat diminished, exposed, trembling in her jeweled dress. Samuel placed the phone on the table, its screen still glowing. This, he said, is not revenge. It is truth. And truth always finds its way to the light. The silence stretched unbearable, until finally Richard Collins spoke, his voice heavy. Madame Zhao, you humiliated one of America's foremost experts on Chinese diplomacy. You have humiliated yourself. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The power she wielded so effortlessly had evaporated, and all that remained was fear. Samuel stood tall, no longer the invisible servant, but the man he had always been. Dignified, unbroken, and stronger than the arrogance that tried to crush him. In that moment, the collapse of Madame Lian's arrogance was complete. 3 months later, the world knew what had happened inside the Golden Lotus. Headlines screamed across the Wall Street Journal, "Billionaire Zhao loses $800 million in contracts after racist videos surface." Overnight, Madame Lianzhao's empire crumbled. The Chinese consulate distanced itself, her family stripped her of executive power, and partners around the globe cut ties. The woman who once entered rooms like a queen now lived in exile, her fortune intact but her dignity gone forever. She had paid the highest price. Her arrogance had destroyed her. Meanwhile, Samuel Carter's story traveled far beyond the walls of the restaurant. The video of his quiet defiance, his fluent Mandarin, and his calm dismantling of prejudice spread like wildfire. 50 million views in a single month. Universities invited him to lecture. Human rights organizations called him a symbol of dignity. The State Department offered him his old position back, with a promotion and a raise. Yet Samuel made an unexpected choice. He returned to diplomacy, yes, but he also kept 1 day a week at the Golden Lotus. Not as a waiter, but as an advisor and minority partner. People from across the world came to dine there, not for the food alone, but for the story. They wanted to sit in the place where a so-called servant had reminded the world that true worth is not measured by status or skin color, but by character. They called it the Samuel Carter Protocol, a movement demanding zero tolerance for discrimination in public places. Samuel often said in interviews, this was never about revenge, it was about proving that human dignity is priceless. His words resonated with millions who had endured silent humiliations of their own. As for Madame Lian, her name became a warning whispered in boardrooms. Arrogance can cost more than money. It can cost everything. And Samuel's story became a light for those who believed themselves powerless. He had shown that silence can hold strength, that patience can build justice, and that respect is not a privilege, it is a right. If you were Samuel, would you have stayed silent for months or spoken out earlier? Share your thoughts below, because your voice matters in the fight for dignity.